Good morning to all of our invited guests, Census Black Roundtable participants, and National Urban League affiliate chief executives. I'm Jeri Richardson, Senior Vice President for the Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives Division here at the National Urban League. Unfortunately, Marc Morial, the National Urban League CEO and President and co-convener of the Black Roundtable, is unable to be here today due to unexpected airline and travel conflicts. But he has asked me to convey to you his deepest apologies, and he has prepared a brief video message, which I'll share with you later in the agenda. I now want to recognize and welcome Roundtable co-convener Melanie Campbell, CEO and President of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation. Melanie and I will be doing double duty filling in for Marc today. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you, Jerica, and welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a treat. Been missing you, Jeri Green, and everyone that's part of the Census Black Roundtable. And what's exciting about this, I want in his absence, of course, want to thank my brother, I'll call him my brother from another mother, Marc Morial, for his leadership, and even more importantly, his friendship over these years. And so it's always an honor to be and fun times as we continue to work through and fight for justice. We can have a little fun along the way. And so what's important about the fact that we're starting now is the understanding as we look back on what happened with the 2020 census, but starting now to get ready for 2020, what would that be, Jeri?
30. Yeah.
We're not trying to rush the ages, but we surely are preparing for the future, because the future is really now when it comes to the census. There's never an end date. In between that decade, there's so much that has to happen. And what I've learned over this to be my fourth census involvement, the single census involvement, because I started as a child prodigy, just so you know, right? But the reality of that is that I learned through my sister Jeri Green, when she was at the Census Bureau, just the importance of Black people showing up and participating and being a part of the process, because it impacts our daily lives, whether we realize it or not. So I welcome everyone today. I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations and looking forward to working with the Urban League and all of the affiliates and all of our friends here at the National Coalition and Black Women's Roundtable and others to just get this done so that we know it makes a difference for our communities economically and in so many politically and in so many other ways. So Jerica, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Melanie. Also joining us today is Black Roundtable member Rev Patrick H Young, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in East Elmhurst, Queens, New York. Reverend Young, will you now lead us in prayer before we start today's discussion?
Yes. Eternal God, who is our refuge and our strength, we thank you for this day and this opportunity to gather together as foot soldiers in your work of justice and righteousness for these people and your people. As we move forward, we ask God for your guidance and direction. We ask for your strength. God, we get weary, we get worn, but we thank you, God, that we're not worn out because you have empowered us this day and infused a strength in us that we may continue to fight for justice and righteousness for your people. Guide us in this conversation, lead us by your direction, and give us wisdom and understanding as we move forward to make a change and make a difference in this nation, in our community, and in the places that we work. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Reverend Young, for those powerful words. Melanie, you and the Black Women's Roundtable are a force to be reckoned with in the fight for voting rights and racial justice. Please share your on-the-ground perspective about what's going on with Black Roundtable members and our Urban League affiliates today.
Okay, thank you, Jerica, and I will be brief. What's going on? What has been going on for especially since last summer, is just mobilizing, really pushing to get our voting rights protected. After the 2020 election, we all know that there's been this tsunami of voter suppression laws that have been added to the books in many states to suppress the vote that turned out in historic numbers. And as we were dealing with the census, we understand the census is also about the ability to count who's here, and race and ethnicity and all that goes with that, and understanding that this country is changing. So there's a backlash to that that's taking place. And in part of that backlash has to do with voting rights and who gets to decide, who counts the vote, who gets to decide or who has power in this country. So we, in the civil rights community, in the Women's Roundtable, and many other communities have come together. We created something called Black Women and Allies back in June, July, and really started utilizing all the mechanisms we can from a organizing perspective, including nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, to really lift up and push for federal voting rights reform protections. That battle continues, in short, because you have not to go in the weeds, but I know I'm preaching a lot to the choir, but we can't get the laws passed because you can't get enough, get the rules changed to allow for a 50+1 vote in the Senate to pass federal voting rights legislation. Really, it's about strengthening or reforming the Voting Rights Act of '65 enforcement powers. The law is there, but it has no teeth to enforce it. And that's what the Supreme Court did with Shelby versus Holder in 2013. And now we find us, and we know because a lot of these laws are being passed that are making it very difficult for people to vote. And it all has to do with one party wanting to control it all. And that's not a partisan thing, it's just a fact. And so we'll continue that fight with our Black women and allies. We're coming up on our summit. We plan to go back to Capitol Hill. All of our friends, George Cheney's friends, told us that they were going to stay with us. They were going to keep fighting, but you don't really feel that fight. And so the Electoral College bill is floating around. People are saying they may put something with that to deal with voting rights. So at the end of the day, the fight continues, Jerica. We have to, because at the end of the day, we do all this with the census and do the count, making sure that we can have opportunities to draw district lines. We know the data is used for that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because we say one of the things about the census count is it's about power. But if you have ability for a law to change the rules, like in Georgia, and say, well, we can take over boards of elections. We can decide that we don't like the results. We can just declare Fulton County as incompetent. So we're going to take over. We're going to control who gets to be a local board of elections. Then it won't matter about the data, because one party can decide they're going to change the results. So it's a different day, one that we've not seen in our lifetime. But our ancestors and our predecessors had more against them than we have. So we will fight until we win, and together we can do that.
Thank you so much, Melanie. We have a question for you in the chat. The question is, what role is the Black Women's Roundtable playing regarding the SCOTUS nominee, if any?
Well, that's one of those long-term advocacy projects we've been working on for over a decade. Goes far back as President Obama's administration. We were really pushing. Black women have been owning our power unapologetically to lift not just Black women, but our communities by leveraging that power. And one of those glass ceilings was the ability to be represented on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so here we have a former candidate who kept his pledge, and now President Joe Biden with Vice President Harris. The Biden-Harris administration is keeping their promise. And their promise was to Black women that they would if he had an opportunity to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court, he would do so. And with the retirement announcement from Justice Breyer, we are now at this moment, but it didn't just start. It's been even before my advocacy. And the thing that's powerful about where we are in the midst of a lot of other things against us is that we are moving forward in many ways. When we started this advocacy over 10 years ago, my friend Nicole, hey there, Nicole, is that you couldn't have told us 10 years ago we'd have a vice president would be Black and South Asian woman. So America's changing. The demographics are shifting. There's just this push for those who want to keep a status quo of white male patriarchy in this country. I didn't say the Urban League say that, I did, right? But we have to keep pushing it. So this victory, soon to be, we're claiming it, won't be easy. We have to fight. We need the Urban League leaders. Y'all keep fighting, because once this announcement's made in the next 72 hours, there's going to be a tsunami of attacks on whoever the Black woman is that they announce. And so we need to push with, especially if you're in a state where you have Republican senators, tell them to do the right thing, be fair for this nominee, and make sure that that sister, whoever she may be, as brilliant as she will be, and an excellent as her qualifications are, because we had a tsunami of sisters who are qualified to be in that position, that she gets a fair opportunity and that she's confirmed. I hope that didn't take too much time, Jeri.
Okay. No, you didn't at all. And thank you for that. Fred McBride chimed in also about other Black women nominated for federal courts. I mean, you are pushing on that front as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of groups working, right? Our civil rights, the LDS of the world, you got this new group called, not relatively new, Sister Scholars, Power Rising, women, Black women. We've got a collective of sisters who working together. Sisters Lead, Sisters Vote, who Black Women's Roundtable, NCNW, many organizations that are coming together to really push. And it's going to take that, and because we know when Black people are nominated for high positions, and especially Black women and women of color, we have a hard time. That's what happened with Kristen Clark. It was a fight. That's what happened with Loretta Lynch. It was a fight. We know those who have been around long, remember Lonnie Grenier, and others. Dabo, I'm messing up Dabo's last name with LDF, who had a hard time. So we know we always have to be prepared, and we have to challenge our friends to really stay there with us. And we always over scrutinize, because again, all boils down to power and inclusion and access. And we have to fight to make sure that we are able to move our communities forward and have the opportunities as citizens who help build this country of the United States of America.
Thank you, Melanie. So we have one more question from Ioma Iruka. You touched on some of this, but she's asking, what are some of the other big agenda points that we should be thinking about before the next presidential election besides voter suppression? You've talked about some of the nominations, but is there anything else that's top of mind?
Yes, I'm thinking about young people. Young people need some to see some wins. I think it's important that we push on eliminating student debt. Is a critical issue that's impacting us. Issues around affordable housing, that through the COVID crises that's continuing pandemic, that housing is becoming more and more unattainable. Homelessness is increasing. I don't care if you're in a small town to a big city like DC or Atlanta or New York, you're seeing more and more homeless people because they can't afford, people cannot afford to find a safe place to sleep at night. So the access to affordable housing is vital. Let alone, you can't even start talking about wealth building if you can't even find a way somewhere to sleep. So the issues around economic justice are really proud. And there are many other issues, but those are some of them.
Thank you, Melanie. So now we'll watch a video message from the National Urban League President, Marc Morial, followed by a brief census update from Jeri Green, the Urban League's Senior Advisor and Census Consultant. I think we're missing the audio. 1 second.
Sorry, I can't be with you in person this morning. I have been stuck due to bad weather in Memphis and around, and am coming back to New York this morning and simply could not be on the ground in time to do this live. So let me first thank all of you for your continued engagement in the census. The Black Roundtable's advocacy and attention to the census is needed now as much as ever. Our cities and communities took a beating in the 2020 census, not just from the pandemic, but because corrupt presidential leadership interfered with the census count. That's why we took the census to court. That's why we secured a temporary injunction against their efforts to cancel the census early. Of course, ultimately, the Trump Supreme Court allowed the census to be ended early, and that is one of the reasons why we believe there's a severe undercount. Here's my message. The work on the 2030 census has already begun, and the work of the 2020 census is not officially over. We cannot show up a year before the census and expect to get an accurate count of Black communities for redistricting and reapportionment. So we're going to continue to work very hard through the next several months and years to ensure that Black communities get a fair shake from the Census Bureau and from the census process. And we need your engagement in this regard. I want to just take a moment to let you know that the next census must have methodologies and data collection with an equity lens, not business as usual. We must ensure that Black men, children, and Black immigrants are incorporated into the design of a fair count, and that privileged, usually white populations, are not overcounted as they've been for almost every census. Our invited guest today, Denise Ross, a native of my hometown of New Orleans. I want to thank her. Nicholas Jones, the Census Bureau's resident guru on race and ethnic data and research. I want to thank him. And I especially want to thank my sister in the struggle, Melanie Campbell, our co-convener, for her continued leadership. Jeri Richardson, our Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives, is filling in for me today. And of course, Jeri Green, our Senior Advisor. This powerful team will lay out for you the work that we need to do. So I appreciate your work. We'll have another gathering very soon. And I look forward to seeing you in the spring. Have a great conversation and continued hard work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to President Morial for sharing that video with us and those inspiring words. I now want to turn it back over to my colleague, Jeri Green, the League's Senior Advisor and Census Consultant. Jeri, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see. Can you hear me? Everybody can hear me, right? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so it's good to be here this morning. I am Jeri Green, the Senior Advisor for the National Urban League on Census Issues. And as Melanie mentioned, I'm also a census alum, having worked pretty much my entire time there with underserved, historically undercounted populations, which is where I got to know Melanie really well. So today I'm going to discuss some of the emerging issues associated with the potential undercounts of the 2020 census, which we need to have a conversation about. I addressed this issue last week on a panel, and it's very timely because on March 10th, the Census Bureau will release the first phase of its highly anticipated post-enumeration survey, or PES. The PES is an independent survey that measures the accuracy of the census. In the past, the Census Bureau has typically referred to the PES as its report card on how well it conducts its census. However, we know that there was nothing typical about the 2020 census. So you may wonder, okay, why is all this hype and buzz about, what's it all about, this undercount of diverse populations? Well, in actuality, there wouldn't be much of a buzz or hype if we were all undercounted equally. The problem is that some populations are overcounted, typically white, more privileged households, and then the rest of us are shortchanged, some more than others, like Black men who are undercounted from cradle to grave in every age group, undercounted, and then young Black and brown children. So this differential undercount, if you will, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color hurts our communities in redistricting, as Melanie mentioned earlier, in apportionment, as Marc mentioned as well, and in the allocation of about $1.5 trillion in federal aid each year, including the upcoming infrastructure bill and funds, as our soon guest that's coming up, Denise Ross, who will be introduced later, we'll talk about briefly. So, you know, we sounded the alarm back in the spring of 2020 about the possibility of a significant undercount. We saw the signs then. Well, the pandemic hadn't taken quite the form that it has, but we saw it in Black communities across the country, in New York, among Black immigrant communities, in the South, in Louisiana and Florida, among our Haitian brothers and sisters, before the hurricanes, as well as in the northern urban areas in Detroit. And we all know that Michigan lost a seat, a congressional seat. We don't know the magnitude of the problem, but we are involved, the Urban League and other stakeholders collectively, to looking at ways to improve census data so that localities have more accurate numbers for the purpose of federal funding allocations. And one of the ways we're looking at this, we're trying to look at avenues to improve the way local governments can challenge their numbers. The Census Bureau has a challenge process. And Siri is talking to me. I don't know why she is. I don't have anything to say to Siri right now, but she likes what I'm saying maybe. But we're trying to challenge, trying to help the Census Bureau come up with a better method to improve how localities can challenge their numbers. We're also looking at the possibility of using other 2020 census data sets, POP estimates, administrative records, and so forth, maybe to shore up and improve data accuracy, to fill some of the gaps. Again, there are limitations. These numbers, whatever they come up with, if there are any improvements at all, and that's going to be really a part of Director Santos's, what he has on his plate that he's going to have to, deal with. But there are limitations. It's not going to change the apportionment numbers, not going to change redistricting. But the federal funding process is very, very important to our communities as we emerge from COVID and other things. There are other reasons why we're looking at this. There are studies that have predicted an undercount that exceeds the previous census. One analysis, which was quite alarming to us, indicated that the net undercount for the Black population could be as high as 7.25% compared to a 2.3% net undercount in the last census. Similarly disturbing are estimated large undercounts for young Black and brown children. We know that state and local leaders are already sounding the alarm. According to Pew, about 14 states, cities in 14 states, including the nation's 4 largest, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Houston, have asked the Census Bureau for allowances regarding how they might change their counts. Like they want to use other data sets like school enrollment as proof of an undercount. And then we have members of Congress. The House Oversight and Reform Committee recently asked the Census Bureau for a briefing on potential 2020 census undercounting, particularly in Detroit. We already saw that months ago. House members cited a recent analysis, yet another one from the University of Michigan, that found that households may have been undercounted by as much as 8.1%. So, these are the things we have been looking at, and we want you to know, and I think my former colleague, Nicholas Jones, has who will be addressing you later, put something in the chat, a site. On March 10th, the Census Bureau will release its first set of numbers on the undercount. We're all waiting on these numbers. Unfortunately, they're only going to be national level estimates, but nonetheless, we'll get our first glimpse. And a week prior to the release of this information, on March 3rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there's going to be a webinar on these results where the public and the media will be allowed to ask questions on the methodology and the whole gamut about what this undercount is really telling us. So you're invited. We have the link there for you to register if you're interested in attending. And in closing, I just want to say we're still doing the good work. Last week, a couple of weeks ago, Marc met with the new census director, Rob Santos. And in that setting, he shared Black Roundtable priorities regarding prison-based gerrymandering. He talked about the differential undercount of Black men and children and foreign-born people of African descent who are in our community. He talked about federal funding impacts to cities and localities because of a census undercount, perhaps. And we advocated for more granular sub-state data on the undercount that will help local leaders understand exactly where people were missed in the 2020 census. And in closing, I just want to recognize 3 people in the audience. We have a new roundtable member, Mr. Julio Guiti Guevara, who has joined the Black Roundtable. He's a Honduran native, an international business lawyer who has worked tirelessly on behalf of African descendant Latino populations. He's also a member of the Census National Advisory Committee on Race and Ethnic and other populations, and would be an excellent asset to the Black Roundtable. I want to give a shout out to Janine Abrams McLean, who's the president of Fair Count, the organization that Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams founded a few years ago. Janine and I and others have been on task forces. She's a task force leader in stakeholder discussions looking at pathways for a more accurate census count. And she's also working hard to ensure that the next set of leaders in data science and analysis look more like us, look more like people around the table. And last but not least, I do want to do a special shout out to Karen Narasaki, who works on behalf of census stakeholders in the philanthropic community. Karen continues to be a strong advocate for our fellow census stakeholders and keeps funders apprised of the work that we do in our issues. And the Urban League is not the only organization. There are plenty of us out here who need to be involved. And I'm hoping Karen hears this message. So thank you, Karen, Janine, and Julio, and back to you, Jerica.
Thank you, Jeri, and welcome to our new roundtable members. And thank you, Karen, for joining us. You have been so supportive of this work. Jeri, we have a few questions for you in the chat.
Okay.
One comes from Brandy Williams. Brandy asks, are there states and cities where we are seeing more undercounting than others? And I think Janine has shared a resource as well, but Jeri, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, that's the problem, Brandy. We really don't know the magnitude of the issue, and the Census Bureau is only going to provide national level data. Now, what we do know, we did in the Census Counts campaign, we were tracking states. We were looking at response rates. So you can actually go, if the Census Bureau still has this map up, you can see what response rates, where there were lagging response rates across localities. And you can kind of infer where some of those shortcomings and gaps are, but the Census Bureau will not be relaying sub-state data on where these counts are. There are studies out there, and I've dropped a few in the chat. So you can look at the Detroit example where there's research on that. But we don't have really right now, we can't tell you where those localities are. And that's what we're advocating for, more sub-state level data that can point to where these undercounts will be. There will be some metrics, and maybe there'll be some additional metrics, demographic metrics that the Census Bureau is going to release, but I doubt if it's going to be at the level we want to see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jeri. I think you just touched on this. Portia asked, will there be an opportunity to review raw data by state used to inform overall national undercount estimates?
I believe that there maybe not at the state level. And we're all looking for the same thing. All of us want more data. And I'm going to ask Janine, do you know if there's going to be, I'm giving a shout out to she's our task force lead on issues. Do you know if there'll be any raw data, Janine?
Outside of what's being released with the PES data?
Yes.
Not that I know of, but I do know that I do know that through the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force, and my co-chair, Ioma Aruka, is on here as well for one of the subcommittees that we lead, which is basically learning from 2020 and planning for 2030. I know that the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force subcommittees are hoping to get hands on data. I know that there are other studies and organizations that will be analyzing the data. And I think it's just really important for all of us to stay abreast of everything with all the stuff that's going on crazy in the world. We can't let the census kind of go on the back burner. We really have to stay engaged throughout this next decade to make sure that we don't have to start all over. But I'll definitely be on the lookout for those data, and I'll keep folks updated.
Okay.
And Jeri, quickly before we turn to our invited guests today, could you say a little bit more about the overcount versus the undercount? How much should we focus on the overcount of white communities?
I'm gonna take my eyeglasses off when I say this. We need to focus on the overcount. You know, everyone says, oh, those hard to count people, those, people of color, all those people. Well, the overcount is a hard to count population. Why? Because the way the net undercount, we keep saying, oh, 2.some%, that's not too bad. But really the overcount of the white population is what, how can I say this? The raw number, I'm not a statistician, so the number of people who are undercounted in our communities is subtracted from the overcount. So if it's 1 million people undercounted and there's 1,000,001 people or whatever, I don't know, overcounted, the Census Bureau subtracts the undercount from the white overcount, and then we get this little number as that represents the net undercount of our people. The net undercount is not an accurate reflection of, and that's what the Census Bureau is going to issue on March 10th, the net undercount. Well, that's only really a reflection of how many white people were overcounted, not how many people were actually undercounted. So we can provide you more information on how the undercount is measured, but the white overcount, primarily white, not just white, but primarily the overcount is really a problem. And maybe the Census Bureau needs to reimagine, and that's where this looking at data through an equity lens, and that's what we're looking for from this new director. Maybe the Census Bureau needs to recalibrate how it counts its undercount of people. It should not be measured against the overcount. So thank you for that question, Ioma.
Thank you, Jeri. I think we have an additional question from David Hopkins in the chat, but just in the interest of time, Jeri, would you mind responding back to David in the chat so everyone can see your response? His question is really geared toward the fact that we're coming to a point where we say the census itself or the entire data collection process, should it be changed or at least used as a factor for determining funding and other federal state decisions? So Jeri, if you can respond to that in the chat so that folks can see your response, that would be great.
Okay.
All right, and so now we'll hear from our invited guests and speakers. Their programs and work have long-term impacts for all of us. So please make use of their time today and engage them on issues affecting our communities. And you, as we've been doing earlier and as we've been doing right now, feel free to put any questions you may have for them in the chat. First up is Denise Ross, United States Chief Data Scientist for the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Ms. Ross, a public interest technology expert, was tapped by President Biden last year to serve in this role. Prior to joining the White House, Denise served as a senior fellow at the National Conference on Citizenship, and as a fellow at the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. During this time, she was tapped to serve on the Biden-Harris Commerce Transition Team at the U.S. Census Bureau. She has had several impressive appointments in data leadership roles, and we are pleased to welcome her today. Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerica and Jeri and the National Urban League for inviting me today. I wanted to start by thanking you all for the work that you did to stave off the worst outcomes for this decennial census, and for keeping the spotlight on data quality and the downstream implications for redistricting and the distribution of federal funding. Member organizations in the Black Census Roundtable did an extraordinary amount of work on this last census. Just a few examples. As a researcher, I was a huge fan of the quantitative work that Color of Change did to understand the nuances and how groups within the Black community felt about the census, the things that would motivate them to respond, and the messages and messengers that worked. That research both complemented and conflicted with the Census Bureau's research in ways that helped us all do better work. I was in awe of the way that organizations like Fair Count, hi Janine, Baji, and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation worked to make sure outreach approaches were tailored to the needs of Black people in a geography, a community, or an area of organizing focus. As a person who's invested in making sure that census data are as accurate as they can possibly be every decade, I can't thank you enough for all the work you did to make sure our communities are reflected in the data. On a more personal note, it was an honor to work alongside many of you before joining the administration. And I am a better steward of data for the American people because of what I learned working alongside colleagues like the members of the Census Black Roundtable during the 2020 census. 2020 was my third census. I moved to New Orleans in 2001 to organize Census 2000 data into neighborhoods and democratize it so that communities could easily access and use it. After Katrina, my shop produced the data for the city's successful census population estimates challenges, which helped right-size the flow of federal funding coming into the city. And for the 2020 census, I co-led the Census Quality Reinforcement Task Force. I wanted to cover a few things today from my new perch as the US Chief Data Scientist. I work in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, we call it OSTP, under our new acting director, Alondra Nelson. The purpose of my role is to responsibly unlock the power of data to serve all Americans. When I came into this job last fall, I knew that my priorities would be closely aligned with the administration's: COVID, economic recovery, climate change, and equity. I also knew that we would need to build capacity to produce and use data at all levels, including across federal agencies, state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. The pandemic and compounding crises we've experienced over the last 2 years made it painfully clear that getting good data is an all hands on deck type of endeavor, sort of like the decennial census is. Whether it's data on COVID rates, hate crimes, or school attendance, the federal government's data is only as good as what gets reported up from state and local governments. In order to meet the growing need
It looks like Denise has frozen for a second. See if we can just wait for a second for her to see if she's able to log back on. One moment. Thank you for your patience. Jeri, while we wait for Denise to resume, is there anything that you want to add or share with folks? I think we've seen a lot of resources that have been dropped in the chat throughout this conversation. Just don't know if there's any in particular you want to lift up.
Sure. In terms, I see that there's some issues related to data. We've talked about data equity. And there is a group within the Census Counts campaign that is looking to lift up diverse people of color, to change how the current, when you sit at the table and you see that over the years, the same people have pretty much been responsible for analyzing census data, interpreting it for our populations. And there's an effort to diversify that group, especially as folks get older and move on. We want to make sure that that people who understand the realities of what's going on in our communities are at the table. And people who, so we have created a new initiative that's named after the first person of color who actually was an acting census director. He was not confirmed by Congress. James Holmes. It's called the James Holmes Field, and Field stands for, Janine, if you can put in the acronym or IOMA, Future Inclusion, Equity, Leadership, something, where and the Black Roundtable can help us greatly in that regard by sending us names of people who should be at the table, who understand data. And it's the next generation of data scientists. We need to know who those people are so that they can assume these roles and begin looking at and interpreting the data through a racial equity lens. So I'll send you all something. I'll send something to the Black Roundtable. If anyone else wants to chime in on that effort, Janine, I don't know if you want to say anything about the Jim Holmes Field Initiative, but that's where we are.
I do think that just as Jeri said, and data look the way that, when you look at data, that really depends on your frame of reference. And like Jeri said, if we have people that come from the communities that have been historically undercounted, actually interpreting those data, I think it'll make a big difference in how the Census Bureau makes its plans and how advocates are able to plan. And so the field program, I put the acronym in there. Kara Brumfield is really leading this effort. But it is, if you know any data, any students that are in grad students or undergrads that are interested in this type of work, we just ask that you spread the message so that we can get some folks, because in 2030, a lot of folks are going to be tired and they're going to be retiring. And we're going to need people that are, enthusiastic and committed to making sure that communities of color are represented in the data, in the numbers, and in the efforts. And so everybody on this call can help do that.
Thank you, Dr. Abrams McLean. How about now, Jerica, how are we looking?
I think I saw Denise join us. Denise, are you here?
I'm here. My power went out. I'm sorry.
No worries. No worries. We're just happy to have you back.
Oh, good.
We're ready to pick up wherever you feel comfortable.
Excellent. And I clearly, infrastructure is an issue, right? When it rains a little bit and your power goes out. Excellent. Okay. Well, so I know I've taken up a little bit of time with this outage, so I'll be quick. So in order to meet the growing need for data to chart a path toward an equitable recovery, we're going to need more data talent at the table, more representative data talent. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, is some concrete progress we've made on the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. The second thing I wanted to cover is one of my favorite topics, and that's how census data and all the downstream data products inform federal funding, specifically the bipartisan infrastructure law. This infrastructure law is so large, it's really worth getting to know what's in it. So starting with DEIA and jobs, I think I think Yvette posted a couple of links for 2 reports that have come out. So feel free to browse those on your own time. But I just wanted to mention that reports like this inside of government are often hard to find. But as you know from your census advocacy, these types of internal government resources that are publicly available are often really helpful for understanding the guidance that is going internally into federal agencies. So I think you'll find a lot of useful gems for advocacy and amplification hidden inside of government documents. Specifically, the second report has some implications for data talent in the federal workforce. Nafisa Owens, who's my colleague in OSTP and Assistant Director for STEM Education, co-chaired a subcommittee that produced a fantastic compendium of best practices for diversity and inclusion, both within federal agencies and in the programs they support. And so this is science, technology, engineering, and math jobs, which would include the data and statistical work that the Bureau does. So moving on to infrastructure, about half of the new federal jobs needed to implement the infrastructure law are in the field of science, technology, engineering, and math. We know it's important to provide information to communities and stakeholders about these opportunities in federal government. So please keep your eye out for outreach on this, and I'll let Jeri know so she can share any information about webinars on the upcoming federal infrastructure STEM jobs. So moving on to the infrastructure law. This bipartisan infrastructure law is truly a generational investment, $550 billion over 5 years. Another way to think about that is the children in your lives today. This is likely to be the biggest investment in their communities that they will see in their lifetimes. The law covers more than 350 distinct programs, from high-speed internet to creating reliable public transit to replacing the lead pipes that are poisoning whole communities. What's groundbreaking about these investments is that they are being rolled out with the priorities of equitable delivery, creating good jobs, and making sure that what we build will stand up to a changing climate. So I'd like to give you a quick overview of how to come up to speed on funding opportunities that will most impact the communities you work with. You can learn about these and other programs at build.gov, just the word build, BUILD.gov. There's a guidebook that'll continue to be updated and a handy spreadsheet that makes it easy to scan through the offerings, and we'll be keeping it up to date. We are also hosting a series of webinars we're calling Infrastructure School. I sent Jeri, I know Jeri sent around an email about those, and I'll send her links to the recordings to share as soon as they're available. For those of us who are steeped in the language of the decennial census, this is where that concept of census data being used to distribute federal resources comes into play. It's also where we shift into communities using the data to make the case for funding. Decennial data is not generally used to directly distribute funds. Rather, the formulas use the population estimates and the American Community Survey that rely on the decennial as the baseline. And as Jeri and Janine were talking about, the Population Estimates Challenge program has is a mechanism for improving the quality of those intercensal population estimates. So census data, in closing, census data will come into play in 3 ways in this $550 billion law. The first is through federal funding formulas. Although most of the attention is going to the competitive grants, some 3/4 of the spending in the infrastructure law will go through formula grants. That includes things like highway construction, many of the largest broadband programs, wildfire risk reduction programs, flood protection, sewer and stormwater grants, et cetera. Census data, and as I mentioned, specifically those intercensal population estimates, will help drive the large chunks of money to states, but different states have different ways of dividing up the money once it reaches them. The second way that census data will play into the distribution is that many programs are required by the law to prioritize overburdened and underserved communities. There's lots of different language nested within the law that describe those communities in different ways, but it's something to look out for. This includes the Justice 40 program, programs where 40% of clean energy and environmental remediation program benefits need to go to disadvantaged communities. And the third way is that census and other data will be key to local jurisdictions effectively making the case for funding. Building capacity to use data will help the communities that need these funds make the most successful applications for federal funding. So this is all a long way of saying that although the 2020 census is over, there's still a lot of work to do to use these data to make sure that this historic investment makes it to the communities that need it the most. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And for those of you who are tuning in, if you have any questions for Denise, you can drop them in the chat. Looks like we have a question from Jeri. Denise, you were also tapped by the president to serve on his and VP Harris's transition team for census. What are your observations?
My observations are that all of the work we did before the transition really paid off. The years, of following the census, like before the count, during the count, and as it was wrapping up, really positioned the transition to rapidly act to make sure that we kept the census train on the track.
Thank you, Denise. And I will now turn it over to our next presenter, Nicholas A. Jones, Director and Senior Advisor for Race and Ethnic Research and Outreach, Population Division at the United States Census Bureau. As you know, the U.S. population is more multiracial and diverse than ever recorded in the 2010 census. And Mr. Jones will discuss the country's increasing racial and ethnic diversity, including demographics for the Black population. In his role as the Census Bureau's subject matter expert on race and ethnicity, Nicholas leads the Census Bureau's extensive research and outreach efforts to explore alternative approaches for improving data on race and ethnicity for the decennial census. Thank you so much for joining us, Nicholas.
Thank you, Jerica. And I want to thank Jeri also for inviting me today and the members of the Black Roundtable. It's really great to meet with all of you. It's an honor to be here. And I hope the information and the resources that I share today will help to spark your curiosity and help you dig deeper into the 2020 census results. So the results themselves, they really inform and illuminate how the racial and ethnic demographic makeup of our country as a whole and the makeup of our local communities across the country have changed over the last decade. I have some slides today to present to you and also some resource links, which I'll be dropping into the chat. And I hope that you will take time to really look at your local areas across the country to understand how things are changing. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. The 2020 census data provide a snapshot, a new snapshot of the demographic composition of our country. And we produced 2 America Count stories, which are shown here on the slide. I'll drop the links into the chat to help you take a look at them if you're not already familiar with them. But these particular stories are really important because they help to explain the 2020 census results with important context about how the questions that we asked, as well as the questions that we were not permitted to ask, help to inform us about the complexity of our nation's racial and ethnic makeup, and also the diversity of our country and how it's changing. There are multiple measures of composition and of diversity which complement the 2020 census redistricting data release itself, those statistics, those data tables. These stories really help us to understand and explore the richness and the complexity of the nation's population in a new light. On the next slide, please. To help frame the discussion of racial composition, we've been using concepts of race alone, race in combination, and race alone or in combination. These concepts have been in place for about 20 years, since the 2000 census, when the 1997 standards were revised for race and ethnicity data in federal statistics. And particularly in 2020, they're central to understanding how our country's demographics have changed. The results on the slide that are shown here show the national level findings for the racial composition of the United States in 2020. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Focusing more closely on the Black or African American population, the 2020 census results show us that the Black or African American alone population at 41.1 million people accounted for 12.4% of all people living in the United States. This is compared with 2010 with a population of 38.9 million, which made up about 12.6% of the population. But coupled with the 5.8 million respondents who identified as Black or African American in combination with another race group, such as Black and white, or Black and American Indian, or Black and Asian, the Black or African American alone or in combination population totaled 46.9 million people, which was 14.2% of the total population in 2020. And since 2010, the Black or African American alone population grew 5.6%, and the Black or African American in combination population grew 88.7%. So it's really important to understand these statistics and look at them holistically for both the alone, the in combination, and the total alone or in combination population to get a perspective of the Black community in the US. Next slide, please. So another important highlight for the 2020 census results is that for all racial categories, their in combination or their multiracial component populations accounted for most of the overall changes in those racial categories. And you can see this here on the slide where the medium blue bars in the center of each population category are larger than the navy blue bars on the left and the light blue bars on the right. If you go to the next slide, this is going to be illuminated here, focusing on the Black or African American population, but also you can see in context the other groups alongside of the graphic. So highlighted on the slide, we're showing that the Black or African American alone population grew 5.6%, and the Black or African American in combination population grew about 90% since 2010. Next slide, please. You can also examine these statistics for the nation, as well as for every county and every state in the country, using a really cool interactive data visualization tool that we built. This tool, which I'll drop into the chat and hope you can take a look at while we're talking, is something that helps you to interact with the data in a way that the statistics or the tables just don't really provide you with the format to do. So we built this as part of our data release to help the public understand the results and how they're changing for their part of the country. You can see here on the left-hand side of the slide that there are bar charts that show the Black or African American population in terms of its proportion for every state, from highest to lowest. You can see the map illustrates with the index and the legend in the bottom, the states across the country where the Black or African American population is larger in terms of its percentage. And then you can also use the tool to zoom in to that particular state by either clicking on it or selecting the state in the drop-down menu. And then when you click on that state, it will show you all of the counties in the state, and you can see those distributions there. You can also go back and forth between 2010 and 2020 to see how these populations have changed over the years. And you can do this for every racial and ethnic group, as well as the cross-tab of Hispanic origin by race, and looking at the alone, the in combination, and the alone or in combination populations. So those are just some of the key features. You don't have to jump in and do it without a tutorial. We created a data gem to help walk you through it with a little video, but I hope that you'll use these tools to really understand the data in a new light. On to the next slide, please. So in addition, our team analyzed and illustrated how the 2020 census results allow us to measure our nation's racial and ethnic diversity and how this diversity varies at different geographic levels. Our measures of diversity enable us to see how all racial and ethnic groups are distributed across the country, how they're interconnected, and also how we can understand our diversity in new ways. The measures of diversity refer to the representation and the relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population. So as a measure, diversity is maximized when all of the groups are represented in an area and they have equal shares of that particular population, whether it be the state or the city or the neighborhood. And I'll highlight the approaches that we use to measure racial and ethnic diversity. They're shown here on the slide. There's a diversity index, there are prevalence rankings and a diffusion score, and we also created a series of prevalence maps. So I'll put this into the chat as well, and I hope you can interact with it as I'm talking about some of the findings. On to the next slide, please. So one measure that we developed is a series of prevalence ranking graphs. This is shown here on the slide, and the prevalence graphs show the percentage of the population, in this case, the percentage of the nation's population or the state's population that falls into the largest race or ethnic group. And these groups are shown here on the left-hand side of the slide with the legend, or the second largest group or the third largest group. And in addition, there's a measure called a diffusion score shown on the right with the fourth column, which shows the combination of all of the other groups that are not in the first, second, or third largest group. And that really tells you how much these groups are unconcentrated in a particular area. So in the graphic, the colors of the bars represent the different racial and ethnic groups shown in the legend on the left. And we can see here that the first column shows that the orange bars, which are for the white alone, not Hispanic population, show that that population was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group for all states in the country, except for the states of California, Hawaii, New Mexico, the District of Columbia, a state equivalent, as well as Puerto Rico. The next slide, please. In 2020, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, became the largest racial or ethnic group in California, comprising 39.4% of the total population. And Hispanic or Latino was also the most prevalent group in New Mexico and in Puerto Rico. The Black or African American non-Hispanic population, shown here with the blue bar, was the most prevalent group in the District of Columbia. Asian non-Hispanic, shown in red, was the most prevalent in Hawaii. And using our data diversity visualization tool, which I dropped into the chat, you can see these results for every state. You can also dig deeper into the data to look at counties across the country, and you can toggle back and forth between 2020 and 2010 to see how these demographics have changed. Next slide, please. So in another way, a measure of prevalence can be shown through the use of maps. And these maps help to show the geographic distributions and the patterns in racial and ethnic diversity across the country. The first map shown here displays the most prevalent race or ethnicity group by county for 2020. And in 2020, just like we showed with the bars, the white alone non-Hispanic population, shown in orange, was the most prevalent group, and in this case for counties, in about 90% of counties. The Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the most prevalent group in some counties in the South. Hispanic or Latino, shown in green, most prevalent in counties in the Southwest and West. And in purple, the American Indian and Alaska Native alone non-Hispanic population was the most prevalent group in counties in the Four Corners region of the US and the Southwest, as well as in counties in Alaska and the Upper Great Plains. Now on the next slide, we see another map which shows much more variation. This is a map that shows us the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group. And what we see here is that there is more racial and ethnic diversity, more representation, and more patterns that are not as tightly clustered in specific regions. For example, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, was the second most prevalent group in counties spanning the entire continental US, with large numbers of counties in every region. The multiracial non-Hispanic population, shown in teal, was the second most prevalent group in many counties throughout the northern part of the country. And counties where the Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population, shown in blue, was the second most prevalent group, are shown throughout the South and also parts of the Northeast and the Midwest. And again, you can use this data visualization tool to zoom in to states and counties to see the results more closely. And you can also compare the distributions with 2010 and 2020 maps to see how things have changed. So finally, on the next slide, I just want to encourage all of you to read our America Counts stories and use these interactive data visualization tools to explore the maps and the graphics that we built to help illustrate the 2020 results in comparison to 2010. And you can access these tools from our website, census.gov, and also the data gems or the video tutorials that I mentioned to help walk you through how to use the data visualizations. So I want to thank you for the time. I know we have a really short time today, but I encourage you to reach out to me. I listed my email address here. If you have any questions about the results or the concepts or the tools that we've built, I'd be happy to talk with you directly about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for sharing all of those resources for us in the chat. I do want to keep this moving, but briefly, there's a question about infrastructure. Either you or Denise should feel free to respond. How will the administration help undercounted communities get their fair share of infrastructure funds?
I can answer that. So I think the biggest thing that the infrastructure team is leaning into is making sure that all communities, especially those that have lower resources and lower capacity to respond to grants, that we lower the barriers for everybody to apply for the grants. And that's, we know that the initial barriers to applying and the capacity to deliver and then report are all reasons why why leaders choose not to apply for the grants in the first place. And so by just making it easier for everybody, that's the number one priority in terms of improving access.
Thanks, Denise. Nicholas, we have another question. How many Black people, especially foreign-born, are in the huge some other race category?
Thanks. So that's a really good question to unpack. Some of the race is a category that is now the second largest category in terms of racial groups in the United States. This is something that we predicted because of the use of two separate questions for asking individuals to report their race and their ethnicity. The some other race category is primarily composed of responses that cannot be classified by the definitions created by OMB into either white, Black, American Indian, Asian, or Pacific Islander. And they are primarily responses that are of Hispanic origin, where someone answers the race question and says, I'm Salvadoran, I'm Cuban, I'm Dominican. So to that respect, they are primarily Hispanic responses, but there may be people, and we see this in the 2020 results, who report both a race and their Hispanic identity. So they might say that they're Black and Salvadoran or Black and Cuban. In that case, that individual will be counted as part of the some of the race alone or in combination population, so they would be there. But there are also countries or nationalities that are not defined by the standards that are included in some of the race because they can't be easily aligned with that standard. So for example, if someone reported that they were Brazilian, it's not defined within the OMB standards, it remains in some other race. There may be other groups that are in there as well, but again, they're primarily people who are reporting their identity as something other than what's listed on the form, and how those cannot be classified into those groups. What's innovative about the 2020 census, and you'll see this in some of our future data products where we release detailed racial and ethnic group statistics, is that we provided a detailed write-in area for the Black or African American population and for the white population for the very first time. And I'm talking about the first time since 1790, where we're collecting data, coding data, and preparing to tabulate data on groups such as Jamaican or Haitian or Nigerian, German, Lebanese, Moroccan, etc. And so those details are to come, but that's a very, very important part to help us understand even more about our nation's diversity within groups and across groups.
Thank you, Nicholas. So I have one other question, and I'll ask if you can respond back in the chat. What percentage of the Hispanic population identify as white, Black, etc.? Is there a breakdown?
Great. I'll drop a link to the chat again, and that's covered in our America Counts story. Thanks, Jerica.
Perfect. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Joy Cheney. Joy is the Executive Director of the National Urban League's Washington Bureau, and she's also the Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. She will now facilitate a conversation on Urban League census advocacy and engagement with the Congressional Black Caucus. Joy?
Thank you so much, Jerica. It is wonderful to work with you, and really kudos and congratulations to the entire Black Census Roundtable under the leadership of Jerica Richardson and Jeri Green, our colleague. We just really appreciate Morial and Melanie Campbell and others, but I'm sure I'm going to get in trouble. But those are folks I wanted to highlight who I know have been doing and have been steeped in this work. And thank you to everyone who's come before, and really Denise and Nick really providing for us the details, right? And their expertise, and Jeri as well. For Rico and I, who are going to go next shortly after we hear from our Lauren Underwood, we want to provide the congressional context, right? And what do we do about it from the legislative front? But first, I want to introduce a video. I believe we're going to the video first. Is that right, Jerica? Wonderful.
That's correct, yes.
Great. I want to introduce a video. Lauren Underwood, who is a dear friend, was not able to join today, but she is leading on the census issue in the United States Congress, in part because when you look at where she's from Illinois' 14th district, and you look at all the demographic changes that are happening in the great state of Illinois and how that impacts, right, what happens across the country, but all of the demographic changes, all of the different ethnicities are all located, not just in Chicago, but a little outside of it as she is. And so she is the perfect person. And when you see that, she also sits at the intersection of all the healthcare work that is going on in this country. She's the sponsor of the Momnibus and all of that. She understands so intimately how we are counted, how we are measured, whether people know we are there, impacts the redistricting, but also how we receive the services and benefits that allow our communities to thrive. So with that, I want to turn it over to Lauren Underwood, the Congresswoman from Illinois' 14th District.
Hi, everybody. I'm Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, and I have the honor of representing Illinois' 14th Congressional District. I would first like to thank the National Urban League for inviting me to speak today and for convening this incredible group of advocates and leaders for the 2020 Census Black Roundtable. I also want to thank each of you for your extraordinary work that ensures that our voices and communities are heard and counted. I am so honored to be with you all today as we discuss a very important issue, the 2020 census. As we know, census data plays an enormous but often silent role in Americans' daily lives. It informs legislative representation and the distribution of hundreds of billions of federal dollars and other resources each year. But we also know, thanks to preliminary reporting from the National Urban League, that the Black population may have been undercounted in the 2020 census at a rate nearly 3 times as high as the previous 2010 census, and nearly 10 times as high for Black children. The census has a long and troubling history of undercounting Black communities, which skews political representation and helps drive economic inequities. Because redistricting is based on census data, the undercounting of Black communities in the decennial census directly results in the underrepresentation of Black communities in Congress. Moreover, a census that does not accurately represent Black communities robs us of our equal share of federal resources in education, healthcare, housing, nutrition assistance, and many other areas. In the House, I'm working to ensure that the census counts Black communities accurately. This month, my colleague Dwight Evans and I are leading the Congressional Black Caucus and sending a timely oversight letter to the Department of Commerce and the Census Bureau, expressing our deep concerns about reports of a Black undercount. This letter asks the department what it has done to study the differential undercount of the Black population in the 2020 census, what it will do to remedy the undercount, and how this can be addressed in the 2030 census. The Black census undercount is just one battle in our fight for fair representation, for voting rights, for democracy at large, and for truth itself. Your engagement is critical to our success in this ongoing fight and to ensuring that our communities are finally equally and fairly represented. I'm going to stay engaged on this issue, and I know you will do the same. Once again, my sincerest thanks to each of you for your work on the Census Black Roundtable. I am so grateful for and inspired by your leadership, and I look forward to working together to fight for our representation in the census.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Underwood. So I'd like to bring on now another colleague and friend, Daryl Rico Doss. Daryl, are you there? There you are. And everyone knows we all call him Rico. Daryl, is it okay if we call you Rico for this purpose?
Absolutely. Call me what you will. I'm just happy to be invited.
Yes, we're so glad to have you here. Friends, Rico is the Senior Counsel and Policy Director of the Congressional Black Caucus. And in that role, he's sort of a permanent counsel, right? He's been over more than one chair, I believe, but maybe that's right, he'll correct me, but he is currently working for Chairwoman of CBC, Joyce Beatty, who is not with us today, but Rico was able to fill in for her and kind of give you a sense of what the Congressional Black Caucus has been doing around these issues. So, Daryl, I'm calling you both names. Rico, I'll open it up to you. And just, I'm going to ask you a question, but I also want to give you an opportunity to say anything about what your boss has been working on in these issues, and from your perspective, why you think this is so important.
Right. Thank you, Joy, and want to just salute all of the presenters, thoughtful and well-organized presentations. It's kind of like going after the headliner in a comedy show when you're going after these true experts. But I'm going to do my best to fill in and
For
also
the context people.
from a legislative perspective. Chair Beatty has got her foot on the pedal and is not letting up. I see the esteemed Melanie Campbell on the call, whom I got arrested with my boss last summer over voting rights, and all of this dovetails together. So voting rights, the census, what's going on with race and justice issues, health issues, as Congresswoman Underwood pointed out. My mother lives in Illinois, right out in the heart of Chicago, and these issues affect how people are treated on a day-to-day basis, and it affects our members. But just on a base level, it affects representation. So in having more Black members in Congress, having more Black women, let me just give a shout out to our pending Supreme Court nominee. I have on good authority it's going to be a Black woman. I'm going to say who it's going to be, but I mean, one of the things I took away from this, and Chair Beatty has stressed, and our CBC staff have tried to impress upon people, the fact that there's 15, 20 Black women in the running, at least in the beginning, tells you everything you need to know about affirmative action, about diversity and inclusion. These women weren't considered before. They sure as heck weren't considered when Trump was choosing Justice Coney Barrett. They sure as heck weren't considered when he was choosing Judge Kavanaugh, and justice, if not even more qualified. So that tells you everything you need to know about diversity and inclusion and why the census is important. But I don't need to preach to the converted. Like any good pastor, you let it speak for itself. The spirit is already here. So I just want to add to it. So thank you for the introduction, and then I'll happy to engage on some questions.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'd love for folks to put questions in the chat, and I will be monitoring those, and the team, including Yvette Badu-Namaku, who works with Jerica and I, is on the call and has been helping behind the scenes, as well as Susie Feliz and Cara Morris. I don't want to overlook them because we could not do it without them. Let me go on, Rico, and just ask you, the first question, sort of, what do we do about it, right? So we've described the water, okay? We're drowning a little bit, and we need someone to throw us a lifeline. What are we doing? Not just about, we're going to talk about the future, but I mean, is there anything that we can do about the undercount? We can't change the numbers, but is there anything we can do to reimagine how Congress, or excuse me, how the census impacts our maps and our federal funding, especially, with the acknowledgement that our communities and needs change more than every 10 years? I mean, are we thinking outside the box?
I think we are. We have very creative members like Congresswoman Underwood, who's a staffer I'm working with on a letter, which I'm going to quote from shortly, and Congressman Dwight Evans, who was my former boss when I moved back from Japan 5 years ago on a fellowship. Congressman Evans and Congresswoman Underwood are working on a letter along with the CBC. And the letter is asking some very real questions, and get to the heart of your question, Joy, which is, this doesn't seem to be working, especially for Black and Brown people. So what can we do to address this? Now, some of these things, we can work on our own. So the kind of outreach that Stacey Abrams has done down in Georgia, just foot patrol, getting out there, getting out to the people. What she did is something extraordinary. And the census is often a day-to-day process. It's getting boots on the ground and getting into areas where people may not expect. going to where are people? Where are they? And where are the people? Where's the undercount? Is it in the millennials? Is it in the generation Y or what is it, Z? I'm losing track, but I know that there's people that are not being counted because I'm in chats with people, and I won't call any names, but they may be my friends and family who, because of their skepticism, if I may, about the government and what it's done to Black people, they're skeptical about the census. And so we need to let's make sure we address that elephant in the room. And then again, using the experts like Nicholas, like Denise, and using that data and then coming up with creative solutions. But the thing about Congress, I was once asked, well, what do you do in Congress? Well, what can Congress do? Congress can do anything it wants to do. Congress should have a gangster rap soundtrack behind it because we make the law. So we can do what we want to do when we want to do it. And so that's what we can do. Now, are we doing it? Are we doing it on voting rights? Melanie Campbell and Joyce Beatty would say no. And we got to fix that. Are we doing it on the Build Back Better Act? I'm sure that there's people on this call that would say no, and I would too. So we can do what we want to do. But I know that under the leadership of Chairwoman Maloney, whom I worked with when I was on Financial Services Committee last Congress under Lacey Clay, she's working on it. Her staff is working on it, but there are creative approaches that we can take. So but also we're looking for all the input that we can get.
Absolutely. So, but one of the things that you all can do is also hold hearings. And we in this roundtable have called on Congress to continue to put their foot on the gas and continue to hold congressional oversight hearings. And so where does the CBC stand on this? Have you all requested these hearings as well? Where are you with us there? And if you had a hearing, what are the questions that you would want to see asked that haven't already been asked?
And I don't want to sound like a bureaucrat here, but we all are in some way, right? Of course we are. We're there with you, and we have several members of the Congressional Black Caucus who are on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, but that's not the only committee that has jurisdiction. There's some jurisdiction, I believe, that's in the Judiciary Committee, or some aspects of this that could be handled by the Judiciary Committee, and should be. And so we're behind you.
Committee as well, for sure.
Yes,
and
so
yeah, an approach.
And in the Senate, it's probably a hodgepodge of committees, but we're just again, my boss. It's been just an honor to work for her. I know it's kind of standard congressional speak to say that about your boss, but I was with Congresswoman Beatty on January the 6th, 2021. And what I saw was, as a South Sider from Chicago, what I saw was a woman of courage. And when we convene, when our meeting tomorrow or Saturday, and she has geared up towards this, there's no stopping what we can do. But hearings is just one part of it. I think staff and members need to be briefed more. We need there's an education that needs to take place, and then of course the outreach that goes along with that.
So Rico, one of the things, and I always ask one tough question before we go to the chat, but we know that there are some groups who are focused, I guess, in the public more on census, and there's a perception maybe that CBC Black Caucus is not as focused. Now we know that you guys got a lot going on, so I want to, where does this fit in the priorities of the CBC, and so how does it relate? I mean, how can we use it to raise it in the priority level?
Well, Chairwoman Beatty has established a war room, and with CBC leadership, and the war room is designed to talk about issues just like this. And our numbers are as high as they've ever been, and this is our 50th anniversary year, as most of you may know. And this is part of the conversation. She doesn't want to be the chairwoman where the numbers went down. So we only want to go up from here. And so obviously there's some permutations to that in terms of the counts and representation overall, and versus Democrats having more seats. And you know, the voting rights experts and gerrymandering experts can, you know, get into that. But we're focused, and as you know, you and your staff know, we have been working on this. For example, this letter that we're going to be sending out in the next few days to Commissioner or Director Santos and Secretary Raimundo. We have been.
Let me jump in there. Have you met with them yet? Have you all had a chance to meet with them?
We've met with Secretary Raimundo, and we'll be meeting with her again, but not Mr. Santos. But we will. That's part of our ask in the letter, is to meet with him and make sure that he's attuned to what the needs are that you know, that we have. The other part of this, I should also add that Chair Beatty is plugged into what's going on in the West Wing. So we're very confident in the choice that President and Vice President have made in putting this gentleman in that position. So we're going to be working with them, and we, you know, there's a camaraderie that's there. Vice President Harris is a member, and she'll always be a member of the CBC. You can't leave. But there's also an accountability there. So we're not standing around cheering everything that they're doing, not on the Joyce Beatty's watch and you know, not under my watch. So
she holds them accountable. You do too.
Well, we have to, and it's, you know, representation matters. We're happy to have them in there, but if they're not doing anything, we're going to hear about it first. Black Twitter is relentless.
Yes, asked and answered. Black Twitter will definitely handle it. I'm going to go into our last question, and it's from Janine Abrams McLean. And by the way, that previous question was from Jeri Green. This question is from Janine McLean, and she's saying, what can advocates, like most of us on this call, do to get Congress to invest in the 2030 census preparation now? So this is the future part. We're working on what we can do to clean up the past and do what we can, but we know that predominantly we got to prepare for 2030. What can we do now?
Well, based on what I heard this morning, I came on at a little before 10, and I figured, I was told that I would come on at, you know, be speaking at 11, but I listened to what's going on because I need to be educated on this too. I'm not going to make myself out to be a tin horn census expert this morning, and that's just doing what you're doing. This is great work. You should be applauded, and just keeping in touch with what's going on the ground, and then doing what you're doing. You're an advocate. You don't hesitate to call me, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention your colleague Susie Felice, who is also between the two of you ganging up on me, which is what you should do.
Yes.
And Yvette as well, but you two have been pinging us and letting us know, and my colleague Vince, who's just started as the executive director, a great hire from the White House. And so we have we got to be plugged in, and there's got to be communication. I think I stressed that. And just like when we did the letter together with Congresswoman Underwood's staff and Congressman Evans' staff, got to have communication on all fronts, and we got to have more efforts. I mean, at the end of the day, the work that Stacey Abrams in Georgia has done has laid a foundation as to what needs to be done. And basically what she did was follow the blueprint of what was done in the 60s and the 50s. And it wasn't, it was genius in its simplicity. And that's what we have to go back to that. So, and again, I appreciate the experts speaking, and then feel free to reach out to me directly. And I'm going to put my email in the chat, and happy to follow up with you and things that we can work on. And then, you know, if we need to do another letter just on one aspect of what's been going on here, we can work on that as well.
We appreciate it. I'm particularly interested in that overcount piece. And let me just say, thank you, Rico, so much for being here today. As the chief federal advocate for the National Urban League, let me say, I would love to see us get our funders to give us the resources we need earlier so that we can do census work. Doing it 2, 3, even 4 years out really isn't enough to do the groundwork, the investment in organizations, you know, who would then be able to do that work. We need it earlier. We can do so much when we have those resources, and getting not just C3 dollars, but also C4 dollars, right? To invest in putting the pressure we need on members of Congress, nonpartisan pressure, it might still have to be C4, to put the pressure that we need on them to say that this is important to us, and that in those elections leading up to 2030, we are measuring their success and our support against their engagement around the census. We have to elevate it as an issue. This is a tough town. There's only one way to go, and that's the hard way. You have to let them know that it matters to you and that it will matter to you at the ballot box. We never again want to be playing catch up, trying to figure out how to undo the damage that someone else has intentionally been doing. Those who are against us plan, and we have to do so as well. And this Black Census Roundtable is aimed at doing just that. Thank you so much to Jerica for allowing me and the Washington Bureau to be represented on this roundtable. Rico, thank you so much for being here. I turn it back over to you, Jerica.
Thank you, Joy. And a special thank you to Cara, Susie, and Yvette, and the entire team at the Washington Bureau for really making today's convening possible. I really appreciate your thought, your partnership, and your leadership, and we just couldn't do it without you. And thank you to all of our distinguished speakers, our co-convener, Melanie, Reverend Young, Jeri, Denise, Nicholas, and Rico. And many thanks to all of you for attending today's Black Roundtable meeting. We will be sure to provide you with additional information on the Black undercount when that data is released next month. Until then, be safe, be well, and thank you so much for being a part of our movement. Take care.